If you have ever woken up at 3 in the morning with your sheets soaked in sweat, the fan pointed straight at your face doing absolutely nothing, and the only thought in your head being how many more hours until sunrise brings any kind of relief, you already know this feeling in your bones. You know the version of summer where the walls of your apartment feel warm to the touch, where opening the window only lets in more hot air and the buzzing of insects, where your kids cannot sleep and neither can you, where every plan for the day gets rearranged around which room, if any, is bearable after 2 in the afternoon. Maybe you have stood in front of an open refrigerator just to feel a few seconds of cold air on your skin, or pressed a damp towel against the back of your neck before trying to fall asleep again, counting the hours instead of sheep, watching the ceiling fan spin uselessly above you while the heat just sits in the room like an unwelcome guest who refuses to leave. People who have never lived through a real heat wave without relief think it is just discomfort. It is not. It is exhaustion that builds on top of exhaustion, night after night, until your whole body and mind feel like they are dragging through water, until even simple decisions feel harder than they should. What almost nobody realizes is that the very thing keeping you alive and sane through those nights today, that quiet hum coming from a metal box on the wall or outside your window, exists only because one young engineer in New York was trying to solve a problem that had absolutely nothing to do with comfort. He was not thinking about sweaty nights or restless children. He was thinking about ink on paper. And the accident that came out of that narrow, specific, almost boring problem ended up reshaping where humans live, how cities grow, how economies function, and even how the planet itself behaves today. In the summer of 1902, in Brooklyn, New York, a 25-year-old engineer named Willis Haviland Carrier was hired to fix a printing problem at the Sackett and Wilhelms Lithographing and Publishing Company, a large commercial printer that produced magazines, advertisements, and color plates for clients across the city. The issue seemed almost trivial compared to what it would eventually become. Humid summer air drifting in from the East River was making the paper at the printing plant absorb moisture unevenly, which caused it to expand and contract slightly between print runs, sometimes by fractions of a millimeter that would have been invisible to the naked eye on their own. Each color in a multicolor print had to align perfectly with the one printed before it, layer over layer. And when the paper swelled, even by that tiny fraction, the colors landed slightly out of place, blurring edges and ruining entire batches of magazines and advertisements that then had to be thrown away and reprinted at the company's expense. Carrier was not asked to invent comfort for human beings. Nobody at Sackett and Wilhelms cared whether their employees felt cool or warm. He was asked to control humidity so that ink would land where it was supposed to land. Nothing more poetic than that. That was the entire assignment. A narrow industrial headache with a deadline, a budget, and an annoyed client. Nothing resembling the comfort of a bedroom or a movie theater anywhere in the brief. To understand how strange and important this moment was, you have to understand what summer actually meant for almost every person on Earth before this. There was no such thing as a cool indoor space in the middle of July. Not in a rich household and not in a poor one. The difference was only a matter of degree. Wealthy households in cities like New York, Chicago, or London relied on blocks of ice cut from frozen lakes in winter, stored in underground ice houses packed with sawdust for insulation, and delivered by horse-drawn wagons to be placed in wooden ice boxes that cooled food for a few hours before melting into a tray that someone had to remember to empty. Most families simply endured the heat with whatever tools they had, hand fans made of paper or palm leaves, damp cloths pressed against the back of the neck, and shutters closed against the worst of the midday sun, even though that meant sitting in near darkness for hours. Windows stayed open day and night, inviting in mosquitoes, street noise, and soot from coal furnaces and passing trains, all in exchange for a few degrees of relief that often never came. In tenements across major cities, entire families slept on rooftops, on fire escapes, or in public parks during the worst weeks of summer. dragging mattresses and blankets up narrow stairwells because the air inside their apartments had become genuinely dangerous to breathe and sleep in. Newspapers from the period ran annual headlines counting the dead from heat waves, the same way they would later count casualties from storms, and hospitals reported sharp spikes in deaths during the hottest stretches of July and August, especially among infants and the elderly, a pattern doctors at the time bluntly labeled summer complaint, a phrase that sounds almost gentle today but described real preventable suffering. Factories ran at reduced output during the hottest months because workers fainted on the floor next to machines that themselves overheated and occasionally caught fire. Food spoiled before it could reach market stalls, and milk delivered in the morning could be undrinkable by noon. Theaters and concert halls often closed for entire seasons because nobody wanted to sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers in a packed, airless room in August, and audiences who could afford to leave the city for the mountains or the coast simply did, creating an entire seasonal economy of summer resorts built around nothing more than the promise of slightly cooler air. The very rhythm of the calendar year, when schools closed, when courts adjourned, when business slowed to a crawl, was dictated by heat in a way that almost nobody alive today, sitting in a climate-controlled room scrolling through a video, can fully imagine in their bones. Even something as simple as sleep itself was a negotiation with the weather, with families taking turns fanning each other by hand through the worst hours of the night, and children being sent to bathe in cold water multiple times before bed, just to buy a few extra minutes of comfortable rest before the heat crept back in. Carrier had grown up on a small farm near Angola, in upstate New York, the son of parents who valued precision, patience, and quiet observation of the natural world, traits that would later define the way he approached engineering problems. He studied mechanical engineering at Cornell University, graduating in 1901 with a thesis already focused on the practical behavior of gases and moisture, then joined the Buffalo Forge Company, a manufacturer of heating and ventilation equipment, where his job was to deal with exactly the kind of unglamorous industrial complaints that nobody else wanted to handle. According to several accounts passed down through his own later writings and interviews given decades afterward, the breakthrough moment came not in a laboratory full of equipment, but on a foggy train platform in Pittsburgh, where he stood waiting for a connection on a damp night and found himself staring at the mist hanging in the cold air around the lamps. Watching that fog thicken and thin depending on the temperature, he began working out in his head, almost as a mental exercise to pass the time, how temperature, humidity, and what scientists call dew point related to one another in a precise mathematical way, essentially reverse engineering the same process by which nature itself created and dissolved moisture in the air every single night. From that almost accidental flash of insight, born out of boredom on a train platform rather than years of laboratory funding, he developed a system that did something nobody had achieved with real scientific precision before. It actively controlled both temperature and humidity at the same time by forcing air over coils chilled by circulating cold water or refrigerant, condensing the excess moisture directly out of the air, the same way fog condenses on a cold window, and then circulating that now dry, cool air back into the room through a network of ducts. He filed for a patent on what he called an apparatus for treating air in 1906, a dry, almost bureaucratic name for something that would eventually touch nearly every human being on the planet. It is worth repeating just how unglamorous the original goal was. Carrier was not trying to make anyone feel pleasant on a summer afternoon. He was trying to keep ink from smearing and paper from swelling, to stop one print run after another from being thrown in the trash because the humidity in a Brooklyn warehouse had shifted by a few percentage points. The first wave of impact stayed narrow, exactly inside the industries that, like that Brooklyn printing plant, depended on precise environmental control to keep their products consistent. Textile mills, which had struggled for decades with cotton and silk fibers that became brittle in dry conditions or sticky and unworkable in humid ones, adopted Carrier-style systems to stabilize their production lines, reportedly cutting defective batches by significant margins almost overnight and allowing mills in the American South, where humidity had always been a constant enemy of fine fabric, to compete on equal footing with northern factories for the first time. Pharmaceutical companies, where certain compounds, powders, and tablets degraded rapidly or clumped together in humid heat, began installing similar units to protect the shelf life and consistency of medicines, meaning that the reliability of the pills sitting in a modern medicine cabinet owes something to the same dew point math worked out on that Pittsburgh train platform. Candy and chocolate manufacturers, who had previously been forced to halt production entirely during the warmest months because chocolate would not set or temper properly above a certain temperature and humidity threshold, suddenly found they could run their factories all year long, transforming what had been a strictly seasonal autumn through spring business into a year-round one with steady employment and steady output. Munitions and gunpowder plants, where even small amounts of ambient moisture could ruin entire batches of explosive material, became some of the earliest and most enthusiastic adopters of precise humidity control, a detail that would matter enormously just over a decade later when the United States ramped up production during the First World War. Carrier himself, sensing the scale of what he had built far beyond one printing house, left Buffalo Forge in 1915, along with 6 other engineers, pooling together roughly $32,000 of their own savings, an enormous risk for men with families to support, to found the Carrier Engineering Corporation, betting everything on the idea that controlling air was going to matter far beyond one printing house in Brooklyn, a bet that within a single generation would prove almost comically modest compared to what actually happened. The second wave moved out of factories and into the daily life of ordinary people. And this is where the story stops being about ink and starts being about how human beings actually choose to live, gather, and spend their money. In 1925, the Rivoli Theater in New York installed a Carrier cooling system for its premiere of a major film, and the effect on audiences was almost theatrical in itself. People reportedly lined up specifically because the theater was cool, regardless of what film was playing, with some accounts describing crowds fanning themselves outside in the heat just for the chance to sit inside for 2 hours of artificial winter. This gave rise to the now familiar marketing phrase, summer blockbuster. Since studios began deliberately releasing their biggest, most expensive films during the hottest months, precisely because air-conditioned theaters had become a destination in their own right, a place people would pay to enter, even if they barely cared about the movie playing on the screen. Department stores followed the same logic almost immediately, advertising cooled air as a tangible luxury shoppers could feel the moment they walked through the door, with window signs in the 1930s proudly announcing 20 degrees cooler inside. And sales during summer months rose noticeably in stores that invested in the technology, while competitors without it watched customers walk past their doors toward the cooler building next door. Restaurants, hotels, and train cars adopted the same strategy. And by the late 1930s, cooled air had become a competitive advantage stitched directly into the logic of capitalism itself, something people would choose a store, a railway carriage, or a movie seat for, almost independent of the product or service actually being sold. Office work itself slowly transformed alongside this shift, since employers discovered that workers in cooled buildings made fewer errors, stayed later in the afternoon without losing focus, and took fewer sick days during heat spells, which meant that productivity, not just comfort, was quietly being rewritten by the same dew point calculations from that Pittsburgh fog. Hotels in warm climates began marketing cooled rooms as their single biggest selling point, sometimes even before mentioning the view or the price, and grocery stores discovered that customers lingered longer and bought more items per visit once their stores were cool enough to browse comfortably for half an hour, instead of rushing through in 5 minutes just to escape the heat outside. If you are watching this and you recognize that feeling of dreading summer, of rearranging your whole life around heat, of lying awake calculating how many hours are left before the sun makes things worse again, I want you to know this channel exists for exactly that reason, to dig up the strange, almost invisible inventions and accidents behind the comfort we now take for granted, because understanding where it came from somehow makes the relief feel less like luck and more like something earned by human curiosity and stubbornness. You are not the only one who has stood in front of an open freezer at midnight just to feel something other than heat. And you are not the only one who has wondered, half jokingly, who on earth invented this and why did it take so long? If stories like this help you see the world a little differently, if they give you something to think about the next time you walk into a cool room and finally exhale, subscribing costs you nothing, but it means you will keep getting these histories delivered to you. A quiet little corner of the internet where the small, overlooked moments get the attention they deserve, and where you are never made to feel silly for caring about something as simple as why a room feels cool or why a fan finally helps. I am genuinely glad you are here. I read every comment I can, and I would love for you to stick around for the next one, because there are a lot more of these strange little accidents still waiting to be told. The third wave reached structures far bigger than shops and theaters, the very shape of where people chose to live, and how political power distributed itself across an entire country. Before reliable air conditioning, large parts of the southern United States, the regions now casually called the Sun Belt, were considered nearly unlivable for sustained year-round economic activity by national investment standards, with brutal summer heat driving away both ambitious workers and corporate offices that could simply choose to operate somewhere more comfortable. Census data shows that between 1950 and 1980, states like Florida, Texas, and Arizona experienced population growth rates several times higher than the national average, a shift historians and demographers directly tie to the widespread adoption of residential and commercial air conditioning, which made these regions tolerable for offices, factories, retirees, and families 12 months a year instead of the 8 months that had previously been bearable. Phoenix, Arizona, a city that recorded only a few thousand residents at the start of the 20th century, grew into a metropolitan area of millions, a transformation almost impossible to picture without mechanical cooling, since summer temperatures there regularly climb past 43 degrees Celsius, well above what unaided human bodies can tolerate for extended periods of normal daily activity, like working, shopping, or simply walking to a car. This migration was not a small footnote in economic history. It physically redrew the electoral map of the United States, since congressional seats and electoral votes are tied directly to population counted in the census, meaning that the redistribution of tens of millions of people toward newly cooled southern and southwestern states shifted real political power for decades, an outcome that began as a side effect of an engineer trying to keep paper from swelling in a Brooklyn warehouse. Government buildings, including the United States Capitol itself, installed early air conditioning systems in the 1920s and 1930s, partly because lawmakers, exhausted and irritable in the brutal Washington summer humidity, simply could not function through long legislative sessions, meaning the very debates and laws shaping the country were now being written and argued inside artificially cooled rooms rather than being cut short or rushed by heat exhaustion. Hospitals, too, were transformed structurally rather than just comfort-wise, since reliable cooling and humidity control became essential for sterile surgical environments, for storing blood and vaccines at stable temperatures, and for protecting newborns and elderly patients during recovery, quietly making modern medicine as it exists today entirely dependent on the same principle Carrier worked out for a printing press. Early electronic computers, the room-sized machines of the 1940s and 1950s, built from thousands of vacuum tubes, generated so much heat that they were entirely unworkable without dedicated cooling systems sitting alongside them, meaning that the digital revolution itself, often credited to garages and universities, also quietly depended on engineers borrowing directly from Carrier's original humidity and temperature control techniques just to keep early machines from overheating and shutting down mid-calculation. The fourth wave is the one that stretches across the entire planet, and it carries inside it a strange, almost uncomfortable irony. because the very invention that protects human bodies from dangerous heat has also become one of the forces quietly making the planet hotter. Air conditioning now consumes roughly a fifth of all electricity used in buildings worldwide, according to International Energy Agency estimates. And the number of air conditioning units installed globally is projected to roughly triple by the middle of this century, driven largely by rapidly growing demand in countries like India, Indonesia, and across the Middle East, where rising incomes meet rising temperatures at exactly the same historical moment. Much of that electricity is still generated by burning fossil fuels, meaning that the act of cooling individual rooms contributes, collectively, across billions of units running simultaneously, to warming the atmosphere as a whole, which in turn drives more frequent and more extreme heat waves, which drives even more demand for cooling. A feedback loop that engineers and climate scientists now describe with a kind of weary recognition, since the very tool built to escape heat is, in aggregate, helping manufacture more of it. Cities themselves run measurably hotter because of this too, since the heat extracted from inside buildings does not simply disappear. It gets pumped outside through external units, contributing to what researchers call the urban heat island effect, where dense cities can run several degrees warmer than the surrounding countryside, partly because of the exhaust from millions of cooling units working at once on the hottest days of the year. The exact days when relief is needed most. Entire regions of the world, including parts of the Persian Gulf, have built cities and economies that are functionally only inhabitable today because of mechanical cooling, with indoor environments in places like Dubai or Riyadh existing as artificial bubbles holding back outdoor heat that frequently exceeds safe limits for unprotected human bodies, sometimes climbing past 50 degrees Celsius in the shade during peak summer afternoons. Outdoor laborers in many of these regions are legally required to pause work during the hottest hours, specifically because human physiology, unlike a building, cannot simply install a coil and a fan. A reminder that the gap between the cooled indoor world and the uncooled outdoor one has become one of the starkest divides of modern inequality, separating those who can afford to escape the heat from those who must work directly inside it for their entire shift. Public health researchers now openly debate whether universal access to basic cooling should be treated as a right rather than a luxury, given how clearly heat exposure correlates with hospitalizations, lost productivity, and death among populations without it, an argument that would have sounded strange a century ago, but feels increasingly urgent as global temperatures climb year after year. Data centers, the physical backbone of the internet, the cloud, and increasingly artificial intelligence itself, now require enormous, continuous cooling systems descended directly from carriers' original principles, since the servers powering the digital world generate so much heat that without precise climate control, they would simply fail within minutes, meaning that even the invisible infrastructure behind your phone, your search engine, and the very tool used to write a video like this one traces its survival back to that same dew point insight worked out on a foggy train platform in Pittsburgh more than a century ago. And yet, for all of that staggering scale, all of those rewritten election maps, reshaped economies, transformed deserts, and planetary feedback loops, it still comes back every single time to that one specific, narrow, almost mundane problem in the summer of 1902. A 25-year-old engineer named Willis Carrier, standing inside a printing plant in Brooklyn, sleeves rolled up, staring at a stack of misaligned color plates, ruined by humid air drifting in from the river, was not dreaming about cooling the world, building new cities in the desert, or shifting the balance of political power across an entire nation. He was simply trying to stop humid air from ruining a stack of paper before the next print run, trying to satisfy one annoyed client and keep his job. He solved a small, specific, almost forgettable problem, the kind of problem that gets fixed quietly and forgotten by everyone except the person who fixed it. And in doing so, he quietly rewired how an entire species would choose to live, build, govern, and even how it would, without realizing it, change the very atmosphere it breathes. Somewhere right now, in a hot apartment with no relief or a cooled office humming quietly in the background, someone is feeling the echo of that one Brooklyn afternoon without ever knowing his name, without ever once thinking about a foggy train platform in Pittsburgh or a stack of ruined magazines from 1902. Proof that the smallest, most boring-sounding fix, born from nothing more than an engineer trying to keep his client happy, can end up reshaping the whole world around it, one humid summer at a time.